For the next keynote by SecPod on every attacker leverages weakness, a new dimension to cybersecurity, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Chandrasekhar Basavana, CEO SecPod Technologies. Let's put our hands together and welcome Chandrasekhar on stage. Over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? All right. Good evening once again. So the topic is every attacker leverages weaknesses. What I intend to do as part of this session is to provide a new way of looking at cybersecurity, a new viewpoint or new dimension to how you can fortify your defenses and strengthen cybersecurity posture of your organization. This is one fact that I want to put it out there, and this is something that all of you are already aware, but generally we don't prioritize this. This is the truth with every cyber attack or physical attack. Every attacker leverages some sort of a weakness, whether it is script kiddie, nation-state hacker, any kind of attacker are always looking at one weak point to exploit and then get into the organization's IT infrastructure. And that is true even within the physical security domain, and nothing different in the cybersecurity world. Now, if this truth is understood, attackers are always looking at technological weaknesses or people weakness or process weakness. There are only three kinds of weaknesses that our attackers are after. If this truth is understood by us, let us write this on our wall, that every attacker leverages weaknesses of some kind. The moment we digest this fact, we will start looking at cybersecurity from a totally different angle. And that angle is analyzing infrastructure from the weakness perspective. What do I mean by weakness perspective? If you go back to the statement, every attacker leverages weakness, you will start analyzing your infrastructure from the weakness point of view. Have I configured my firewall okay? Are there any vulnerabilities in the setup? Is there any exposure that it is subjected to? So you'll start asking a lot of questions. To be able to ask questions, you need to really understand the infrastructure also. So that way you will get to know what is that you're trying to safeguard. As a cybersecurity professional, one of the requirements to security is to understand the infrastructure that you're trying to safeguard. Once you get that visibility, you will start asking a lot of questions. As I mentioned, you will understand the weaknesses a lot better and try and fortify your infrastructure, which comprises of typically the devices, which can be the laptop, desktop, servers, workstations, cloud infrastructure, container, mobile device, any kind of devices that are part of your infrastructure, you will understand, you'll start asking all of those why questions. And then the application stack that is running within your data center or the infrastructure, again, you will understand that. Users who are operating on these devices and the infrastructure, you will study that perspective as well. And the data, which is either sensitive data or not so sensitive data, you will start identifying the locations of these data and is there any exposure to those data. And then the network infrastructure that is helping us distribute the information from one to other place. And you'll also start asking questions related to the security controls that have already been deployed. Maybe you have a firewall that is implemented. Maybe there is an encryption product that is already implemented. Are they really working as per your wish? You will start asking those questions. So that is the weakness angle that I'm talking about. So if you look at the right side of this, this is what IT infrastructure comprises of typically, nothing more than that. So holistically, if you start understanding this infrastructure and asking a lot of those why questions, you will figure out that there are so many weaknesses that you will have to deal with before an attacker has the opportunity to exploit those weaknesses. This is the proactive security part that I am talking about. If you holistically look at all of this, you will strengthen the infrastructure security posture and make it so strong that attackers will have a hard time exploiting those weaknesses that we would have otherwise had an easy time walking into the infrastructure, launching an attack, and do whatever they wish to. That can be prevented if you start doing this way. There are other perspectives too. There are not just the weakness perspective that I highlighted, there is also a detection perspective. Detection perspective is the reactive side of security. There is proactive security, reactive security. In proactive security, you're trying to strengthen the security posture so attackers don't have opportunity to exploit those weaknesses. In the reactive security, you will ignore all those weaknesses and you'll believe that whatever attackers do, I am here to defend. That is a wrong notion, because when you have millions of attack variants, how many can you actually deal with? It's like in a game arcade playing a whack-a-mole type of a game where moles are popping up so frequently, you'll be so tired, fatigued, you'll not be able to deal with that. So proactive security is important that way, reactive security is kind of leaving it to chance. There's also a new perspective that is getting developed now called data perspective. The belief here is that everything is data that I'm trying to safeguard. How about putting all the security controls around that data? Again, it is partial way of looking at it, because as part of the infrastructure, it is not just the data, there are several other components that are part of the infrastructure. And there's also an attacker perspective that is getting developed now, which is the penetration testing, where you go ahead and expose the infrastructure to a specialist, ask them to start testing the infrastructure. But that is, again, not a foolproof way of looking at it. So the weakness that I'm talking about is vulnerability that all of us are familiar with. This is something that we have been dealing with for several years, maybe 3 decades or so now. Vulnerability management is not a new domain. It has been there for long. But for some reason, attack persists. Attackers still have the easy opportunity to walk into any organization and break through. The reason why it has not worked so far is twofold. One is discovery takes months. Typically, when you run a vulnerability assessment exercise, it runs into weeks together to come up with a report. And when you come up with a report, the report runs into thousands of pages. And then the IT operations team have a hard task of understanding each of these vulnerabilities and mitigate them. That can take several months. So typically, organizations spend anywhere between 3 to 5 months to mitigate the vulnerabilities that are discovered. What happens if it is a 0-day vulnerability that is being exploited in the wild already? You would want to know it today, and you want to remediate today, not after 5 months. So that is the problem. Number one problem. The vulnerability management is not a continuous process, not an automated process. A lot of human intervention rely on point solutions. Multiple point solutions are being stitched together, artificially stitched together, so it becomes impossible for CISO teams and the CIO teams to collaborate and actually make vulnerability management effective. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is vulnerabilities are not just the software vulnerabilities that have the CVE identifier associated with. There are several other kinds of vulnerability. It can be a misconfiguration, it can be a security control that is not functioning, it can be a posture anomaly, it can be an identity where a privileged access is enabled when there is no need to enable. So vulnerabilities, definition of vulnerability kind of gets extended each time we realize that there is a new perspective that attacker is able to bring. So we are only looking at software vulnerability, we are not looking at all of them. So those are the two problems that we are dealing with, and that is why attackers have the easy opportunity to exploit those. There is a new domain that is getting created recently called exposure management. When there is a vulnerability and does not have exposure, why do you have to care about? But that is, again, if you look at probability of threat, if vulnerability is there and it is exposed, then the threat is there. But today, vulnerability is there that does not have exposure doesn't guarantee that tomorrow it does not have the exposure. So you will have to holistically look at all kinds of vulnerabilities. So when you start analyzing the infrastructure from this perspective, you will start understanding the attack surface, you will understand threats and the potential attacks, and start applying the mitigation rules to mitigate all of that. So this is what at SecPod we have been calling it as continuous vulnerability and exposure management. Not just vulnerability management, vulnerability and exposure management. I would like to spend a minute here when I talk about management. Typically, vulnerability management is limited to discovery of the vulnerability. You're actually not managing the vulnerability. Why do we call it as vulnerability management when you're actually not mitigating the vulnerability? Vulnerability management tools that have been there is all about focusing on discovering as many vulnerabilities as possible, and they say it's not my responsibility anymore. So it cannot be called management. And continuous. The process is not continuous and automated. Today, we don't have a way to know the vulnerabilities as and when they become available for us to discover. So it needs to be a continuous and automated process. It needs to have a mitigation part combined as part of the management. And you will have to look at vulnerabilities and exposures collectively. So this is what we have created, a framework for vulnerability management or continuous vulnerability and exposure management, where we give visibility to the infrastructure on a continuous basis. You know all kinds of infrastructure elements that are there within the organization on a daily basis. And you will have the opportunity to normalize the infrastructure, to make it known good, and then detect vulnerabilities of all kinds, not just the software vulnerability, and then prioritize these vulnerabilities based on environmental and business context and vulnerability and threat intelligence, and most importantly, remediate these vulnerabilities within the same framework and report it. Make this into a continuous process, continuous and automated process. So this is the framework that we at SecPod have implemented on devices, cloud infrastructure, applications, all kinds of entities that are part of it. Discover the vulnerabilities, potential threats, and the exposures, and make this into a continuous remediation process where you are constantly fixing the vulnerabilities on a day-on-day basis, where your security posture is strengthened on a continuous basis, not on an irregular monthly or a 3 to 5 months once in a while type of a approach. So the call here is to shift the focus to weakness management, vulnerability management, or exposure management, because it makes sense to believe in proactive security and not reactive security. There are so many things that we can do proactively to eliminate the possibility of attack as against fighting the war when the attacker is already inside the organization's infrastructure. Majority of the attacks can be eliminated that way if we prioritize or start looking at the weakness angle that I proposed. So rethink cybersecurity from the vulnerability and exposure management perspective. Thank you all. If you would want to see this in live, we are at booth number 40. You're welcome to visit there and take a look at it. Thank you once again.